7:10 in the morning, June 4, 1942. Ensign Albert Earnest sits in the cockpit of his Grumman Avenger on a tiny strip of coral called Eastern Island. He's 25 years old. Richmond, Virginia. 6 missions under his belt, not one successful torpedo drop. Behind him, in the gun turret, sits radio man Harry Ferrier. 17 years old. Springfield, Massachusetts. High school diploma still fresh. Below them, in the belly gun position, Seaman J. Manning. 19. Seattle. They'd been a crew for exactly 72 hours. Out there, 180 miles to the northwest, the entire striking power of the Imperial Japanese Navy is steaming toward them. 4 aircraft carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, the most powerful naval force on the planet. And Ernest is about to fly straight into the heart of it, carrying a weapon that fails 7 times out of 10. The engine turns over. 2,000 horses of radial power. The propeller catches, metal spinning into a blur. Ernest checks his instruments one last time. Altitude gauge, fuel mixture, torpedo release. He knows the odds. Everyone knows the odds. In the turret behind him, Ferrier racks the charging handle on his .50 caliber. The sound is sharp, final. They all know what's coming. But here's the thing nobody talks about. The thing that haunts the ready rooms and keeps pilots awake at night. It's not the Japanese fighters they're afraid of. It's not the wall of anti-aircraft fire they'll have to fly through. It's the torpedoes slung beneath their aircraft. The Mark 13. On paper, it's the most advanced torpedo bomber weapon in the world. 22 inches in diameter. 13 feet of streamlined steel. 600 pounds of Torpex explosive in the nose. 50% more powerful than TNT. Enough destructive force to break the keel of any ship afloat. But there's a problem. A problem so catastrophic, so systematic, that it's killing American aviators faster than enemy action. The torpedo doesn't work. 36% run cold. The engine never fires. 20% sink immediately on water impact. 20% veer off course, spinning in wild circles or diving too deep. 18% run at the wrong depth, passing harmlessly beneath their targets. Only 31% function as designed, less than 1 in 3. And every pilot in the Pacific knows it. The Navy knows it too. The Bureau of Ordnance has documented every single failure. Reports from Pearl Harbor, from the Coral Sea, from every engagement. The pattern is undeniable. Torpedo after torpedo, failing to run, failing to arm, failing to explode, men dying to deliver weapons that won't detonate. And everyone knows exactly where the fault lies. Newport, Rhode Island. The Naval Torpedo Station. 1 Factory. 1 Design Bureau. 1 Testing Facility. A monopoly that's controlled every aspect of American torpedo production since 1920-3. No competition. No alternative suppliers. No pressure to innovate. Congressional representatives from Rhode Island have protected Newport's exclusive contract for 2 decades. Any attempt to build torpedo manufacturing elsewhere gets buried in committee. Any criticism of torpedo performance disappears into classified reports. The factory workers are on peacetime schedules. 40-hour weeks. No overtime. They're producing 100 Mark 13s per month when the Navy needs 500. But here's what makes it worse. Here's what makes it unforgivable. The Navy has known about these failures since July of 1941. 11 months before Midway. 5 months before Pearl Harbor. Torpedo Squadron 6 conducted training exercises. 10 torpedoes dropped under perfect conditions. 5 went off course immediately. 4 sank. 1 ran somewhat normally. 1 out of 10. Reports were filed. Tests were conducted at Naval Air Station Patuxent River. The results were undeniable. Dropping the torpedo at anything over 150 knots caused the rear fins to collapse. The impact with water crushed the delicate steering mechanisms. The torpedo would sink, circle, or porpoise along the surface like a wounded animal. Sometimes the warhead just fell off. After the Battle of Coral Sea in May of 42, recovered Mark 13s were examined. 3 torpedoes that had failed to detonate after perfect drops. All 3 had intact warheads. All 3 had armed properly. The problem was the Mark 6 exploder mechanism. The firing pin was too fragile. when the torpedo hit a ship's hull at any angle other than perfectly perpendicular, the pin would bend or snap before it could trigger the detonator. Engineers calculated that the Mark 6 would fail to detonate approximately 40% of the time, even on direct hits. These reports were sent to the Bureau of Ordnance on May 20, 1942. 15 days before Midway. They were stamped secret. Filed away. No action taken. No modifications approved. And pilots kept dying. Earnest takes off as part of a 6-plane detachment, led by Lieutenant Langdon Fieberling. Within the hour, 5 of those 6 Avengers will be burning wreckage in the Pacific. Fieberling, dead. Charles Brannan, dead. Oswald Gaynor, dead. Victor Lewis, dead. Darrell Woodside, dead. Every single gunner, dead. 15 men total. All killed delivering torpedoes that wouldn't work even if they reached their targets. Only Earnest survives. He lands his Avenger with 64 bullet holes punched through the fuselage. 9 20mm cannon strikes. Manning, his belly gunner, slumped dead in the turret. Ferrier, wounded but breathing. The torpedo fell out somewhere over the ocean. The release mechanism shattered by Japanese fire. Earnest never knew if it would have worked out. He never knew if Manning died for nothing. The sound of the engine fades. Silence settles over Eastern Island. Mechanics rush to the shot-up Avenger. They count the holes. They look at the empty bomb bay. They don't say anything. They don't have to. This is the reality of American naval aviation in the summer of 1942. Brave men, advanced aircraft, and weapons that betray them. The problem isn't pilot skill. It's not tactics or training. It's physics. More specifically, it's what happens when a 2,000-pound torpedo hits water at high speed. Water is incompressible. At velocity, hitting water is like hitting concrete. The Mark 13's internal mechanisms were designed in 1925, back when aircraft flew at 80 miles per hour and dropped torpedoes from 50 feet. But by 1942, torpedo bombers are flying at 300 miles per hour. The torpedo hasn't evolved. The gyroscope that controls direction shatters if subjected to more than 10 gs of deceleration. Water impact at 150 miles per hour creates 15 gs. The depth control mechanism, a simple hydrostatic valve and pendulum system, jams if the torpedo enters at more than 30 degrees. The propeller shaft bends if the torpedo hits at any angle other than perfectly flat. The Bureau of Ordnance knows these limitations. They've tested the Mark 13 extensively at Newport. Their solution? Restrict the drop parameters so severely that torpedo bombers become flying coffins. Fly straight and level. 130 miles per hour. 100 feet altitude. Directly at the enemy ship. Maintain that course for at least 10 seconds before release to allow the gyroscope to stabilize. Drop at exactly 800 yards. Any deviation means failure. Following those parameters means flying through concentrated anti-aircraft fire for 30 seconds or more. It's a death sentence with extra steps. By August of 42, the losses are catastrophic. At Midway, 15 Devastators from Hornet are shot down. None score hits. 6 Avengers from Midway Island, 5 shot down. 0 hits. Eastern Solomons. 7 Avengers lost. They sink 1 light carrier, but only because multiple torpedoes are dropped and Japanese damage control fails. Most of the torpedoes that hit don't explode. October 1942. Battle of Santa Cruz. Lieutenant Commander John Collett leads Torpedo Squadron 10 from Enterprise against Japanese carriers. His squadron drops 12 torpedoes at the carrier's Rikaku. Perfect position. Textbook approaches. Regulation height and speed. 2 torpedoes hit. Neither explodes. Collett's Avenger is shot down by Zeros immediately after release. His gunner, aviation radioman 2nd Class William Woods, manages to transmit one final message. Torpedoes hit but no explosion. Tell them the torpedoes don't work. William Woods was 19 years old. His body was never recovered. Ensign George Morgan from the same squadron survives Santa Cruz. That night, he writes in his diary, "We might as well be dropping telephone poles for all the good these torpedoes do. Tommy Morrison got a perfect drop on a cruiser today. Saw it hit right amidships. Nothing. The torpedo just bounced off and sank. Tommy got shot down 30 seconds later. His last words on the radio were cursing the Bureau of Ordnance. Lieutenant Bruce Harwood of Torpedo Squadron 6 writes a letter to his wife in November. The censors redact most of it, but what remains still conveys his frustration. We are being asked to do the impossible with equipment that's censored. I've lost 6 of my best friends in the last month. All flying perfect attacks that censored. If this war is lost, it won't be because of the pilots or the planes. It will be because censored won't admit censored and fix censored. The censors removed all references to torpedo failures, but Harwood's widow understood what he meant when she received his personal effects after he was killed at Guadalcanal in January 1943. The pilots know. Every torpedo squadron in the Pacific knows. They talk about it in ready rooms, write about it in letters that censors redact. But they keep flying the missions, because that's their duty. And because some of them start looking for their own solutions. Late 1942, the California Institute of Technology gets brought into the torpedo problem, not by the Navy. By the National Defense Research Committee, the civilian scientific board trying to mobilize American technology for the war effort. The Navy hasn't asked for help. The Bureau of Ordnance insists the Mark 13 is satisfactory. It's the pilots who are dropping them wrong. Dr. Charles Lauritsen doesn't believe that. Lauritsen is a physicist at Caltech. He's been working on rocket development. When he's asked to examine the torpedo situation, he doesn't know anything about torpedoes. But he knows physics, hydrodynamics, what happens when objects hit water at high speed. January 1943. Lauritsen's team sets up a testing facility at Morris Dam, northeast of Los Angeles. They build a 300-foot slide down the face of the dam. At the bottom Morris Reservoir. A mountain lake with crystal clear water that allows high-speed underwater photography. They start dropping torpedoes, not live ones, weighted dummy units the same size and weight as Mark 13s. They film everything. High-speed cameras on the slide, underwater cameras in the reservoir, cameras on boats tracking torpedo paths. The first thing they discover is shocking. The Navy's drop doctrine is completely wrong. The manual says to approach at steady altitude and speed, release at a specific distance, maintain course until impact. Lauritsen's films show this creates the worst possible water entry. The torpedo oscillates during its fall, swinging nose up, nose down, like a pendulum. It hits the water at random angles. Sometimes flat, sometimes nose first, sometimes tail first. Each angle produces different failures. Flat impacts cause the torpedo body to flex. The 2,000-pound weapon compresses like an accordion. The gyroscope shatters. The depth control jams. The propeller shaft bends, even if the torpedo starts running. It veers off course or porpoises along the surface. Nose first impacts drive the torpedo too deep. The Mark 13 is designed to run at 10 feet. A nose first entry can send it down to 50 feet before the depth control reacts. By then, it might pass beneath the target's keel. Or the pressure change damages the warhead detonator. Tail first impacts are catastrophic. The propeller and rudders hit first, bending, breaking off completely. The torpedo has no directional control. No propulsion. It simply sinks. Lauritsen calculates there's only a 15-degree window of acceptable entry angles. The chance of a torpedo naturally falling within that window, less than 20%. Everything the Navy believes about torpedo drops is backwards. The doctrine says torpedoes should be dropped low and slow to minimize water impact. The films show that low, slow drops cause the torpedo to belly flop. The flat impact crushes internal mechanisms even at reduced speeds. The torpedo needs to enter the water at a specific angle, between 20 and 25 degrees. Too shallow, it skips. Too steep, it dives too deep or breaks apart. But achieving that angle from 100 feet at 130 miles per hour is nearly impossible while being shot at. Lauritsen has an idea. What if the torpedo could be stabilized during its fall? What if they could control its entry angle regardless of drop height or speed? His team starts experimenting with attachments. Small parachutes, too complex, unreliable. Metal fins, too heavy, affect underwater performance. Then someone suggests looking at how the Japanese dropped their torpedoes. December 7, 1941. Japanese Kate torpedo bombers devastated Pearl Harbor with their Type 91 torpedoes. Those torpedoes had wooden box fins attached to their tails. The boxes broke away on water impact, but they stabilized the torpedo during the fall. American intelligence recovered several unexploded Type 91s from Pearl Harbor. The wooden attachments were noted. Like a barrel wrapped around the warhead. Navy pilots who first see it start calling it the pickle barrel. The pickle barrel works. It creates drag during the fall, slowing the torpedo's descent by 40%. Combined with the shroud ring, it allows the torpedo to be dropped from 800 feet at 260 knots, and still enter the water at the correct angle and speed. The pickle barrel breaks away on impact, leaving the torpedo to run normally. April 1944. Lauritsen's team conducts a demonstration for Navy officials. 6 torpedoes dropped from a Navy bomber. 1,000 feet, altitude. 300 knots. All 6 enter the water cleanly. All 6 run hot, straight, and normal. The Navy officials are skeptical. Laboratory conditions, control tests, combat is different. But word spreads. Through unofficial channels. Through ready room conversations. Through mechanics who know other mechanics. May 1944. Squadron mechanics start reaching out to Lauritsen directly. Can they get the modifications? Lauritsen says yes. But it's unauthorized. The Bureau of Ordnance hasn't approved anything. They don't care. Aviation machinists mates from multiple squadrons fly to California. The meetings take place in a warehouse near the Naval Air Station, away from official Navy facilities, away from Bureau of Ordnance inspectors. The warehouse smells of machine oil and fresh cut plywood. Workbenches line the walls, covered with torpedo parts, measuring instruments, the strange-looking shroud rings and pickle barrels. Lauritsen personally shows them how to install the modifications. The shroud ring installation is precise work. 4 holes drilled through the torpedo's tail cone at exact locations. Too close to the edge, the aluminum might crack. Too far inward, they interfere with control surfaces. The bolts torque to exactly 35 foot-pounds. Too loose, the ring might shift during flight. Too tight, it could deform the tail cone. The pickle barrel is simpler but still requires precision. 3/4-inch marine plywood, cut into a 40-inch ring with a 24-inch center hole, split in half and hinged, allowing it to open and close around the torpedo's nose. 4 steel bands hold it in place, tightened with turnbuckles to exactly 50 pounds of tension. The mechanics practice on dummy torpedoes for days. Lauritsen's team watches, corrects, guides. After training, they can install the modifications in 20 minutes. Lauritsen gives them detailed drawings, precise measurements, material specifications, step-by-step installation instructions, everything stamped. Unofficial, not approved by Bureau of Ordnance. In red letters. He tells them to share the information quietly. If the Bureau finds out before they have combat proof, they'll shut everything down. The mechanics return to their carriers. They work at night, after regular maintenance hours. They tell their pilots what they're doing. The pilots keep quiet. Better to ask forgiveness than permission. June 19, 1944. Battle of the Philippine Sea. Torpedo squadrons from Task Force 58 attack the Japanese carrier Hyle. Using modified torpedoes for the first time in combat. 8 Avengers drop from 600 feet at 220 knots. Higher and faster than any successful torpedo attack to date. 6 of 8 torpedoes run true. 3 hit Hyle. All 3 explode. The carrier sinks. It's the first time in the war that American aerial torpedoes have performed as designed. The squadron leaders report the success, but don't mention the modifications. They say their pilots got lucky. But other pilots in the strike notice something different. The torpedoes enter the water like arrows. No splash. No tumbling. No deviation. Pilots who've seen dozens of torpedo drops know this is different. After landing, mechanics throughout the task force are cornered by pilots asking what was done to the torpedoes. The mechanics show them. Within 12 hours, every torpedo in the fleet magazines is being fitted with shroud rings and pickle barrels. Mechanics work through the night, Teams of volunteers helping .by dawn on June 20th. When the carriers launch strikes against the retreating Japanese fleet, every Avenger carries a modified torpedo. The results are dramatic. 24 torpedoes dropped. 19 run hot, straight, and normal. They sink 2 destroyers, damage a cruiser, not a single Avenger lost. To anti-aircraft fire. Word spreads through Task Force 58 like wildfire. Pilots from Enterprise visit other carriers to see the modified torpedoes. Mechanics from Lexington fly over in COD aircraft to learn installation. Within a week, the installation drawings have been copied and distributed to every carrier in the task force. The Bureau of Ordnance finds out when staff inspectors visit carriers. They see mechanics installing pickle barrels in broad daylight. The inspectors file immediate reports, demanding all modifications be removed. The responsible parties court-martialed. The reports reach Admiral Mark Mitcher, commander of Task Force 58. Mitcher has seen the combat results. He orders the modifications to continue. He tells the Bureau that combat effectiveness takes priority over regulations. The modifications continue. By August 1944, every torpedo squadron in the Pacific has shroud rings and pickle barrels. The official designation is Mark 13 Mod 2A. But pilots just call them ringtails. The transformation is immediate. Battle of Leyte Gulf, October 1944. Avengers sink the super battleship Musashi with multiple torpedo hits. April 1945. They sink Musashi's sister ship, Yamato. The same torpedoes that failed so miserably in 42 are now the most effective ship killers in the American arsenal. The Japanese noticed the change immediately. Commander Masatake Okumiya, air officer aboard carrier Junyo, writes in his after-action report that American torpedoes have suddenly become lethal. Where previously Japanese ships could absorb multiple hits, now single torpedoes are causing catastrophic damage. The Americans are dropping from heights and speeds that should be impossible. Japanese anti-aircraft doctrine, based on forcing torpedo bombers down to low altitude, is suddenly obsolete. Captain Toshikazu Ami, operations officer for the combined fleet, conducts an analysis in September 44. He notes that American torpedo hit rates have increased from less than 10% in 42 to over 40% by mid-44. More disturbing, the percentage of hits that cause fatal damage has increased from 20% to 70%. The torpedoes are not only hitting more often, they're exploding reliably. Ami recommends Japanese ships avoid combat with American carrier forces until the secret of the improved torpedoes can be discovered. The Japanese never find that secret. Lieutenant Commander Takashi Hashimoto is assigned to investigate captured American equipment. He examines for recovered Mark 13s in October 44. He notes the strange plywood ring around the nose, the aluminum shroud around the tail. He dismisses them as shipping protections that would be removed before combat use. He can't conceive that such simple additions could transform performance. His report concludes the Americans must have developed a new internal mechanism, possibly electronic, that stabilizes the torpedo during flight. He recommends capturing intact Avengers for further study. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, commanding the Japanese center force at Leyte Gulf, reports that American torpedo attacks have become overwhelmingly effective. His flagship Yamato takes 8 torpedo hits. The battleship Musashi takes 19. Both ships had been considered unsinkable. Their torpedo defense systems, designed to handle the older, slower, less reliable American torpedoes, are overwhelmed. The Japanese never figure out what changed. They examine crashed Avengers, recover unexploded torpedoes, but the shroud rings and pickle barrels look like original equipment. Without knowing about the Morris Dam tests, without understanding the hydrodynamics involved, they can't recognize the modifications as modifications. The psychological impact on Japanese naval forces is devastating. Commander Yoshima Yoshimura, executive officer of the cruiser Tone, writes in his diary that American torpedo bombers have become demons of the sea. Where once Japanese sailors watched torpedo attacks with confidence, knowing most torpedoes would miss or fail, now they watch in terror. The sight of Avengers approaching at high altitude, previously a sign they're carrying bombs, now means torpedoes will soon be in the water. There's no safe altitude and no safe distance. The transformation in American torpedo effectiveness changes the entire Pacific Naval War. In 42 and 43, Japanese surface forces operated with relative impunity. Their ships could absorb torpedo hits that didn't explode, could maneuver to avoid torpedoes that ran erratically. By 44, Japanese ships are being hunted to extinction. The combined fleet that seemed invincible after Pearl Harbor is reduced to scattered remnants hiding in harbor. The numbers tell the story. 1942, American torpedo bombers achieved a hit rate of less than 5%. Of those hits, fewer than half exploded. By late 44, hit rates exceed 40%. 95% of hits result in explosions. The kill rate per sortie has increased by a factor of 15. What had been the most dangerous and least effective mission in naval aviation becomes a precision ship-killing operation. Leyte Gulf. The destruction is systematic. October 24, 1944. Waves of Avengers from Task Force 38 attack the Japanese battleship Musashi. The first wave puts 4 torpedoes into her port side. The ship lists but keeps moving. Second wave 3 more into her starboard side, correcting the list but flooding more compartments. Third wave 4 more into the port side. Fourth wave 6 more hits. Fifth and final wave 3 more torpedoes into the dying ship. Musashi rolls over and sinks at 19:35 hours, taking over 1,000 men with her. Every one of those torpedoes had shroud rings and pickle barrels, dropped from altitudes between 400 and 800 feet, speeds between 180 and 260 knots. Under the old doctrine, those drop parameters would have guaranteed failure. With the Caltech modifications, they guarantee success. Musashi, which Japanese naval architects designed to survive 20 torpedo hits, succumbs to 19. Because every hit causes maximum damage. The following day, October 25th, Avengers find Yamato and her escorts off Samar. Lieutenant Commander William Ispel leads 12 Avengers from Hancock in the attack. They approach at 8,000 feet, well above effective anti-aircraft range, then dive at 45-degree angles, releasing torpedoes at 600 feet, traveling at 250 knots. 10 of 12 torpedoes run true. 8 hit various ships in the formation. Yamato takes 3. The cruiser Nagato takes 2. Destroyers take the rest. All explode. The formation scatters, disrupting the Japanese attack on American escort carriers off Samar. Lieutenant Robert Holcomb, flying one of those Avengers, writes in his after-action report, "The torpedo entered the water with barely a splash and ran absolutely straight. No hook, no broach, no circular run. It was like watching a textbook demonstration." The explosion against Yamato's hull sent a column of water 200 feet high. For the first time since I started flying torpedo runs, I had complete confidence my weapon would work. The official Navy history credits improved pilot training and better tactics. The Bureau of Ordnance, in its 1946 final report, claims that continuous refinement of the Mark 13 throughout the war resulted in steadily improving performance. They don't mention the refinements came from civilian scientists working outside official channels. They don't mention hundreds of pilots died carrying defective weapons while Newport insisted nothing was wrong. Charles Lauritsen receives the Presidential Medal for Merit in 1948. The citation mentions his contributions to rocket development and underwater ordnance. It doesn't specifically mention the torpedo modifications. Lauritsen goes back to nuclear physics after the war, helps develop the hydrogen bomb, serves on the Atomic Energy Commission. He rarely talks about his torpedo work. When asked, he says they just applied basic physics to an engineering problem. The squadron commanders who first used the unauthorized modifications survive the war. They train a generation of Navy pilots, telling them the same story. Sometimes the system fails. Sometimes official channels don't work. When that happens, you have to decide whether following regulations is more important than saving lives. They never regret their decisions. The pilots who come back because of those modifications are justification enough. The mechanics who installed the modifications leave the Navy after the war, return to civilian life. Garages and machine shops across America. They have photographs on their office walls, standing next to Avengers with ringtail torpedoes loaded in the bomb bays. Customers ask about them. They say they worked on airplanes during the war. They don't mention their midnight modifications helped sink the Japanese fleet. Aviation radioman First Class Harry Ferrier, the 17-year-old who survived the June 4th Midway attack with Earnest, flies 47 more combat missions. Every time he climbs into an Avenger after August 44, he knows his torpedo will work. He knows someone somewhere fixed the problem that killed so many of his friends. He doesn't know about Caltech or Morris Dam or pickle barrels until years after the war. He just knows that suddenly, mysteriously, the torpedoes work. Ferrier describes the difference in a 1998 interview. Before the modifications, every torpedo run was a prayer. You'd watch the torpedo drop, see it hit the water, and hold your breath. Would it run? Would it explode? Usually, the answer was no. After late 44, it was completely different. The torpedo would drop, enter clean, and run true. You could actually see it tracking toward the target underwater. Steady as a train on rails. When it hit, it exploded. Every time. It was like we'd been given a completely new weapon. Lieutenant George Bush, the future president, flies 58 combat missions in Avengers from USS San Jacinto. September 2, 1944, he's shot down over Chichijima while attacking a Japanese radio station. His two crew members, Lieutenant Junior Grade William White and Radioman Second Class John Delaney, are killed. Bush survives, rescued by the submarine USS Finback. But before being shot down, Bush successfully delivered 4 modified torpedoes in previous missions, sinking a cargo ship, damaging a destroyer. In his memoir, Bush writes about the difference reliable torpedoes made to pilot morale. Knowing your weapon will work changes everything. You can focus on flying, on evading flak, on getting your crew home safe. You're not wondering if you're risking your life for nothing. Ensign Jesse Brown, the Navy's first African-American aviator, flies Avengers with Torpedo Squadron 32 from USS Leyte in late 44 and 45. Brown's squadron exclusively uses ringtail torpedoes. His first combat mission January 4, 1945. Brown puts a torpedo into a Japanese tanker off Formosa. The ship explodes and sinks in 12 minutes. Brown later says that having a weapon he could trust gave him the confidence to prove himself in a Navy skeptical of African American pilots. He knew his success or failure would depend on his skill, not on defective equipment. The modifications save American lives in ways that go beyond improved hit rates. Because pilots can drop from higher altitudes and faster speeds. They spend less time in anti-aircraft range. Because they can attack from multiple angles simultaneously. Japanese gunners can't concentrate their fire. Because more torpedoes hit and explode, fewer missions are needed to sink each target. The Naval Aviation Safety Center calculates in 1946 that the torpedo modifications reduced Avenger combat losses by approximately 60% in the last year of the war. Ferrier lives until 2016. Aged 90. He spends his last decades traveling to veteran reunions, telling the story of Torpedo Squadron 8. Of the men who died at Midway carrying defective weapons. He ends his talks the same way every time. The brave young men who died in 1942 were not failed by their courage or their skill. They were failed by a system that valued bureaucratic control over combat effectiveness. Their sacrifice forced the changes that came later. Every Japanese ship sunk by torpedo after 44 was vindication for the men who died in 42 trying to deliver torpedoes that wouldn't work. The Bureau of Ordnance never officially acknowledges the failure of the Mark 13 torpedo in its original configuration. In a 1946 report to Congress, they state that torpedo performance had been satisfactory throughout the war period with continuous improvements. They don't mention those improvements were forced upon them by combat failures and civilian intervention. The report credits Newport with developing the shroud ring modification, even though the design came entirely from Caltech. It claims the pickle barrel was a natural evolution of existing drag reduction research, ignoring that Newport rejected drag devices for 3 years while pilots died. Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, who commanded amphibious forces throughout the Pacific War, writes a private letter to Admiral King in December 45. He states the torpedo scandal of 42 and 43 cost the Navy more pilots than any tactical error. He estimates that proper torpedoes from the beginning could have shortened the war by 6 months. The letter is classified, buried in Navy archives. Turner never speaks publicly about the torpedo problem. The families of the dead pilots never know the truth. Barbara Fieberling, widow of Lieutenant Langdon Fieberling, who died leading the TBF detachment at Midway, spends 40 years believing her husband died in a fair fight against superior Japanese forces. She doesn't learn about the defective torpedoes until 1987. A historian interviews her for a book about Midway. She breaks down crying. Not from grief. From anger. Her husband died carrying a weapon the Navy knew was defective. Margaret Waldron, widow of Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, who led the 15 Devastators from Hornet, receives a letter from President Roosevelt, praising her husband's sacrifice. The letter mentions his determined attack against overwhelming odds. It doesn't mention his squadron's torpedoes had less than a 30% chance of working, even if they reached their targets. Margaret keeps that letter framed on her wall until she dies in 1993. She never knows the full truth. The Newport Naval Torpedo Station continues as the Navy's primary torpedo facility until 1951. Finally closed. Production dispersed to multiple contractors. The monopoly that cost so many lives is quietly disbanded. No official investigation is ever conducted into why it took civilian scientists to fix a problem the Navy had known about since 1941. The classified reports documenting the Mark 13's failures remain sealed until 1972. The last surviving ringtail torpedo is on display at the National Museum of Naval Aviation in Pensacola. The placard mentions that modifications developed in 44 improved the torpedo's effectiveness. It doesn't mention the pilots who died before those modifications. It doesn't mention the modifications came from outside the Navy. It doesn't mention they were initially unauthorized. History as written by institutions tends to omit institutional failures. But the real history, the one that matters, is simpler. A physicist who knew nothing about torpedoes looked at a problem with fresh eyes. A lieutenant commander risked his career to save his pilots. A mechanic worked through the night to install unauthorized modifications. Together, they turned the worst torpedo in the American arsenal into a ship killer that helped win the Pacific War. That's how technical innovation actually happens in war. Not through official channels or bureaucratic approval, but through people who see problems, find solutions, and don't wait for permission to save lives. The Grumman TBF Avenger became the best torpedo bomber of World War II. Not because it was the fastest, not the most maneuverable, not the best armed, but because someone finally gave it a torpedo that worked. The aircraft had always been capable. The pilots had always been brave. They just needed a weapon they could trust. Between 1942 and 1945, 98,136 Avengers were built. They sank 29 Japanese aircraft carriers, battleships, and cruisers, over 30 submarines. They dropped the torpedo that sent Yamato to the bottom, the largest battleship ever built. But their greatest victory wasn't measured in tonnage sunk. It was in proving that problems everyone knows about can be solved if someone is willing to break the rules. The wooden pickle barrel and aluminum shroud ring, developed in a mountain reservoir by physicists who had never been to sea, saved more American pilots than any improvement in aircraft design or pilot training. They turned the Battle of the Philippine Sea into what pilots called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. They made the kamikaze attacks of 45 an act of desperation by a navy that could no longer protect its ships with conventional forces. Today, every military acquisition program has multiple contractors, competitive bidding, independent testing. The lessons of the Mark 13 torpedo are built into the system. But those lessons were written in blood, paid for by the men who flew into Japanese anti-aircraft fire-carrying weapons they knew probably wouldn't work, hoping that this time, maybe the torpedo would run hot, straight, and normal. The true cost of the torpedo scandal has never been fully calculated. Historian Samuel Eliot Morison, in his Official History of United States Naval Operations in World War II, devoted exactly 3 paragraphs to torpedo defects, he called them. Minor technical difficulties that were quickly resolved. This was the same historian who had access to all the classified reports, who interviewed hundreds of participants, who knew the full truth. But institutional history has a way of minimizing institutional failures. Dr. Norman Friedman, in his detailed technical history, U.S. Naval Weapons of World War II, calculated that proper torpedoes from the start could have sunk an additional 40 to 50 major Japanese warships by the end of 1943. This would have included most of the carriers that later fought at Philippine Sea and Leyte Gulf. The war might have been shortened by 6 months to a year. Thousands of American lives might have been saved. But the real cost can't be measured in ships or months or even lives. It was in the erosion of trust between the fighting forces and the bureaucracy that was supposed to support them. Every pilot who took off knowing his torpedo probably wouldn't work. Every mechanic who prepared aircraft for missions he knew were suicidal. Every squadron commander who wrote letters to widows knowing the deaths were preventable. They all learned the same lesson. Sometimes the system doesn't work. Sometimes the people in charge care more about protecting their positions than protecting the people doing the fighting. That lesson resonates today. In every military conflict since World War II, there have been equipment failures everyone knew about but no one could officially acknowledge. Korea, bazookas that couldn't penetrate enemy armor. Vietnam, M16 rifles that jammed in combat. Iraq, Humvees without armor. Afghanistan, radios that didn't work in mountains. Each time, the pattern is the same. The problem is known. The solution exists. But bureaucratic inertia, institutional pride, and political protection of contractors prevent fixes until public pressure or catastrophic failure forces change. The Grumman TBF Avenger went on to serve in Korea. Its reliability and payload capacity made it valuable for close air support. It served with foreign navies into the 1960s. Restored Avengers fly today at air shows. Their distinctive silhouette and growling radial engine remind us of an era when carrier aviation came of age. But few people watching them know the real story of how they became the best torpedo bomber of World War II. Behind every technical innovation in warfare, there are human beings who paid the price for institutional failure. The next time you hear about a military procurement scandal or a weapons system that doesn't work, remember the Mark 13 torpedo. Remember that somewhere, right now, young men and women are carrying equipment that someone somewhere knows is defective. And remember that it doesn't have to be that way. The best torpedo bomber of World War II wasn't determined by the aircraft. It was determined by the torpedo. And the best torpedo was created not by the system that was supposed to create it, but by people willing to work outside that system to save lives. The distant sound of engines fades. The echoes of propellers spinning over Pacific waves. The memory of young men strapping into cockpits, knowing their weapons might betray them. And the quiet courage of those who refuse to accept that reality. That's the real lesson of the Avengers War. Not the battles won or ships sunk, but the reminder that sometimes saving lives means breaking rules. Sometimes doing what's right means defying what's official. And sometimes the heroes aren't the ones who follow orders. They're the ones who question them.